I wanted to start out by acknowledging my co-authors, Justin and Phaedra. They were really the ones that got this project initiated and developed the efforts to collect a lot of data that went into informing this restoration plan. So I'm going to be talking about the San Rafael River, a project that we've been working on for about 3 years now in terms of developing a restoration plan. And it's in the southeastern corner of Utah. So up here, it's about a 6,000 kilometer watershed. We're working primarily in the lower San Rafael River, downstream of the San Rafael Reef, in between the reef and the Green River. And we're developing this restoration plan to enhance habitat for 3 species of native fish, the flannelmouth sucker, bluehead sucker, and round-tailed chub. And then we're also trying to improve the native vegetation within the Riparian corridor as well. I guess the changes I made. I'm going to skip through this because I presented it before at this talk, and I'm going to just say that due to hydrologic alteration and colonization of non-native species, similar to a lot of desert rivers in this part of the country, the San Rafael has really gone through what we might consider an ecological regime shift. So from a wide, dynamic, multi-threaded system dominated by native fish and native vegetation to more of a narrow, single-threaded ditch-like system dominated by non-native vegetation, tamarisk, and non-native fish. And so to reverse, to address that real, fundamental shift in how the ecosystem is organized, it's really going to take a multitude of approaches, including managed flows, habitat enhancement, and non-native removal. And we are working on each one of these different approaches within the San Rafael River. But for this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the habitat enhancement. And when I talk about habitat enhancement, we're not just trying to add, create habitat through, added structures. We're really trying to work with the processes, the river processes that create and maintain habitat. And so we're trying to assist the recovery of a dynamic system. We know we're not going to move it back to this state that it existed in the early 1900s, but we want to enhance those processes of erosion, sediment transport that really are creating and maintaining fish and riparian habitat. And so back in 2012, we started the planning effort for this restoration project. And again, we really tried to develop our goals and objectives within these constraints, knowing that we're not going to be able to turn the river back into the way it was back in the 1900s. And another thing I want to emphasize is that we really tried to systematically prioritize where we were going to do habitat enhancement on this river. We identified areas where the habitat was intact. It was providing habitat for fish and vegetation. We identified those areas as what we call conservation areas, where we're not going to do any work. We're going to use those as more of our reference areas where we want to, as targets to what we want to improve the rest of the river towards. And then we also identified areas where we think we would have the most benefit through some habitat enhancement, using data on existing habitat and distance to source populations of these native fish. So we really took a systematic approach to identifying some areas where we wanted to start work, and then we'll expand from those priority areas over time, is the goal. And so there's 3 activities I'm going to talk about today that we've implemented on the San Rafael, and one of those is tamarisk removal. And the idea here, again, like I said, we're trying to enhance river processes that create habitat. So the idea of removing tamarisk is to enhance lateral channel migration, increase wood inputs to the river, and then promote native vegetation establishment. And the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources has been doing tamarisk removal down there since 2010 about. And we had some evidence from their work that this tamarisk removal could actually enhance habitat and specifically enhance lateral channel migration to enhance habitat. So this is a picture prior to tamarisk removal, taken, I believe, in about 2010. And then in 2011, there was a really high flow year on the San Rafael, like a lot of areas, like a lot of rivers in the area. And this is taken after that flood. You can see these piles of tamarisk. They remove the tamarisk by plucking the whole trees from the ground and removing the roots. And you can see in places where and you can see the combination of this flood and the removal, it created these scouring areas around these bends, and that's really important for fish habitat in high water. You know, that can provide backwaters and complex habitat for these fish. So it did look like that removal of the tamarisk would enhance these processes that we were trying to really create fish habitat. So another activity that we're using on the river is this, we call it partnering with Beaver. It was pioneered by a group up at Utah State, out of Joe Wheaton and Nick Ballas's lab up there, if you are interested in more information. And the idea behind these, again, that we're trying to enhance habitat formation. On the San Rafael, there are beaver in the area, and where they do build dams, downstream of those dams, there's really often a nice scour hole, a deep pool, which is fairly lacking on the San Rafael and otherwise. And we have observed native fish using that habitat. So we're trying to build these dams to create that habitat, and then we also are hoping to increase the bed elevation behind the structures. So there's a lot of sediment in the water, and we're trying to dam up the water a little bit and create deposition of sediments behind those dams in order to raise the water table and hopefully promote native vegetation establishment. And I'll talk about more about how we constructed those in a minute. The last activity was the gravel addition. So that this is a map of the project area, and we divided it up into these different reaches based on geomorphic characteristics and tributary inputs. And these two areas that are circled are what we call in our conservation areas, where we have intact habitat, and we're not doing any restoration. They're sort of our reference reaches, our targets. And they happen to occur right below these tributary junctions, and it looks like, from what we observed, there was a lot of gravel and, of course, sediment input to the river from these tributaries. And so that was a process that seemed to be creating this beneficial habitat for fish and native vegetation. So we wanted to recreate that by adding gravel into the river to enhance gravel transport and build riffles and gravel bars. And so now I'm going to share some of the results. We implemented all three activities about a year ago. The tamarisk removal occurred in February, and then the other habitat enhancement occurred in May. So we did 63 acres of tamarisk removal. You can see this is before, after. Again, the little dots on the floodplain are piles of tamarisk. We have seen some native vegetation recruitment, mostly from sprouting from willows, where we've removed the dense native vegetation, the dense stands of tamarisk. We've seen some willow recruitment, but we haven't seen any cottonwood recruitment. We didn't really have a very large spring flood event this last year. The gravel addition, we added 2 gravel bars to the river, and those are shown by the stars there. They delivered it in dump trucks, and then they had this rock chucker that spewed the gravel into the river and made these nice textbooks gravel bars on the river. And this is all exotic gravel, so there's no other gravel like this on the river, and so we were able to use this as a real experimental technique to track that gravel through the river system. And we didn't have a really large spring flood event. We did have a fairly significant rain event in early June, and so luckily we got these gravel bars in right before this flood event occurred, and and that flood did mobilize the gravel and transport it, so we were able to track it through the river system. And this is some of the data that we've been getting from this gravel enhancement and tracking. So this is a map of the concentration of these exotic gravels, so the added gravels, moving from the gravel bar upstream, downstream. And you can see we are able to actually recover this gravel and identify it as we move through the system. So we're getting really good insight on the sources and sinks of the gravel, how it's moving through the system, and potentially how we can use that to build riffles and gravel bars that are important habitat for these fish. And then we did see some increased amount of exposed gravels downstream of the bar, indicated here. So that was, that was kind of what we were shooting for, is exposed gravel bars that provide habitat for these fish. And then the beaver dam analogs, we implemented 8 complexes, and there's about 3 or 4 structures per complex. And this is, we built these by hammering these wooden posts vertically into the stream bed and then weaving willow material in between those posts, basically trying to create a beaver dam using human methods. So we put these in at the end of May, and then this same flood event that moved that gravel, that was, I guess, not very beneficial for the beaver dams because that high flow event actually breached most of them. So of the 34 dams we put in, only 3 of them remained fully intact after this flood event. But we did have 3 that made it through. So and that was a 1,000 CFS flood event. So it was a pretty significant flood event. So some of them did make it through, and then even without, even those ones that breached modified the flow through that risk system and still created habitat that we're looking for these fish. So you can see, like around this one, for example, it obviously breached, but it really redirected the flow, created some complex flow patterns, created these little scour holes and some bank erosion, just like we were hoping to see from some of these structures. Oh, that's right. And the breaching, it mainly occurred through post-scour, so it wasn't like they just got toppled over. The sediment of the river is really sandy, and so when we put these structures in, the water got forced underneath the structure and it started scouring out those posts, and then the flow energy pushed it over. So it looked like post-scour was the main problem. Okay, and so we did go back, we measured habitat complexity around these structures and throughout the reach before and after we put them in, and before and after this flood event. And so this is, what I'm showing here is the percent of complex habitat in reaches moving from downstream to upstream, and these are 300-meter reaches. And the percent of complex habitat is the amount of riffles, pools, and backwaters within these reaches. Otherwise, it's just a sandy run kind of system. And the blue bars are before we put in the structures, and then the orange is after. And the numbers are just the number of the beaver dam analogs we had in each reach. And so you can see in some cases there was an increase in the complexity, percent complexity throughout the reach, but in other cases there was a decrease. And so it looked like overall through this whole segment we didn't see a increase in complexity on a reach-wide scale. But around individual structures we did often see some habitat creation locally. So these blue dots are all newly formed habitats. So before the beaver dams went in, there were no pools or riffles or backwaters in these locations, and then afterwards there were. And so there were a number of places where we did create specific habitats through these beaver dam analogs. And it was about almost a little over half of all of the BDAs that we assessed that had the full willow weave did create local habitats. There were a few cases where habitats disappeared, and the BDAs may or may not have had something to do with that. In some cases, they did accumulate a lot of sediment behind them if they breached, and then there was an eddy. So that may have covered up a few riffles here and there, but it also just shows the dynamic nature of the system in terms of the complexity and the habitats being created and disappearing over time. And so I think it's important to distinguish when we're thinking about whether this beaver dam structure treatment was a success or not. I think it's important to distinguish between the short-term goals and the long-term goals. In the short term, I think we accomplished in a lot of cases the enhancement of scour and erosion processes, and so you can see that in a lot of these, even the ones that breached. So this is a beaver dam showing a big scallop erosion of this bank and creation of this backwater eddy here. So in a lot of cases we saw that, and so that was an increase in habitat complexity, like I said. And we also saw it succeeded in the ones that maintained through the flood. We did see this enhanced deposition behind the structures, and you can see this is a person standing above the dam and below, and there's a significant amount of sediment behind these dams, and then the scour pool below the dams. So we think we can build on this for the long term. And we really need to take a long-term view of whether or not this, whether this treatment can be successful. So we did not see an increase in reach scale complexity, but we didn't really expect that, right away. We realized that we're going to have to. It may take a while to get to that reach scale effect size. We really are trying to reconnect the rivers and the floodplains. And so it may take a couple of rounds of installing these dams, building up sediment behind them, and then having that eventually reach to the point where we can start moving the river channel onto the floodplain. And then also, we are eventually trying to get to a self-sustaining beaver population. The idea here is there are beavers in there. They're not building a lot of dams, but it may take a fairly significant change of the river before we can actually get the beaver in there to maintain this dam complex. And so just a few lessons learned. We found that the timing of activities with respect to flows was important. We installed the beaver dams right before a flood event, and that breached a lot of them. We didn't have a big spring flood event to recruit cottonwoods. Through the gravel addition, we found that gravel is available within the channel, and it can, through the right techniques, we can potentially use that available gravel to build some of these bars and riffle complexes. These full BDAs were very labor intensive and they can breach, so we're going to be modifying the procedure to use more partial BDAs and a rougher construction technique. But we did see that local geomorphic processes can be altered by these partial structures, and that they can create some habitat. And so we're really going to be the next step here. We're going to be continuing to monitor and see if those gains in habitat that we have continue to be maintained, or if they fill in with sediment. That's really going to be an important question moving forward. And so this is my analogy for adaptive management. We're going to be revisiting the BDA design, and again, thinking about this long-term, vision to see if we can keep hitting the system with these structures to really increase the reach-wide complexity. So we're going to be continuing to monitor this system over time, and so hopefully I'll have an update again next year. And so this has been a great collaborative project to be involved with, and I'm not going to list everybody by name, but yeah, it's been a great project to be involved with. We had a lot of collaborators, and I'll take any questions if there's time. Thank you.
This is really interesting. There's another way that we've contemplated to bring the floodplain back to the river, and that is to use mechanical treatments to basically lower the terrace and create a floodplain bench. Did you guys consider that in this project?
Yeah, we did not consider that for this first round of treatments, but yeah, what we're thinking about for some of the next round is a little more like that, trying to potentially knocking down some of these berms or in front of side channels and old channels and backwaters. Maybe not necessarily constructing an inset floodplain, but trying to find those low elevation spots near the channel that we can maybe excavate some sediment or put in a structure to really direct some water in there and reconnect it that way. So that is starting to enter our thinking a little bit, yeah.
How are the fish responding to the newly created habitat?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, we did try to go out and monitor the fish use of the newly created habitat. The flows are just so flashy. It was really really muddy the day we went out there, so we didn't really have very good success in terms of capturing fish. So that is something I guess we still need to monitor, and we're going to try to do that this spring and summer as well, is to get to see if the fish are actually using this. There's a potential that the non-native fish may be coming in and using these habitats more so than the natives. So that's going to be a really important question to address.
Can you say a bit more about the techniques you're going to try in the future for the beaver dam analogs? Are you going to try coarser woody debris structures, or is that cost prohibitive given your resources?
Not necessarily more. Well, yeah, a little bit coarser woody debris. We're thinking about potentially using some of the tamarisk that was removed in these structures instead of the willow, as long as it's fully dried out, not going to propagate or something like that. But yeah, a little bit cruder construction and all with the larger wood, and also not so much of the channel spanning. Like almost all the ones we put in were full channel spanning structures, and so we're looking at more like 90% constriction, or where we're kind of like an induced meander type of technique, a little more. Yeah.
Sounds good. And on the West Coast, there's some examples of putting like the large wood debris jams at the mouth of remnant backwater channels and creating local scour and trying to help reconnect things that way without having to span the whole channel.
Yeah, right. We're looking at that as well. And then the places where we did actually see the BDAs maintained through this flood, they tended to be right downstream of meander bends and had some kind of inset floodplain where there was some energy dissipation besides the beaver dam. So we might look at, if we do put in channel spanners, trying to identify those areas where there's a little bit of flow dissipation, either on the floodplain or through the meander bend.
You mentioned that there are some beavers in that stream, but they're not really building dams. Can you elaborate on that? Are they bank beavers? Or?
Yeah, right now they're bank beavers, and there's for whatever reason every once in a while they're able to build a dam. I don't know if they find some bedrock or what it is, but there's like a few dams throughout the system, and so one of the ideas here was that the flood energy is too high for them to maintain the dams, and so we're trying. One of the goals was to try to assist, give them something to build on, that they could maintain these dams through the low energy. So that's turning out to be more difficult than we thought, but right now they're mostly banked. Okay.